Take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
So I watched Tim Dillon's new Netflix special. Tim Dillon is a comedian. He was a friend of Joe Rogan for a while and then kind of branched off and did his own thing. I've given him some credit as being one of the Joe Rogan sphere comedians that like he seems to have built his own foundation a little bit, so he's not quite as tied to the rest of that scene as some of them are. But I think he's a pretty talented comedian. I think he's funny. He's a good yapper. I think some of his takes are bizarre. And, I don't agree with a lot of what he says. And I'll say that as a comedian, he seems to believe what he says more than a lot of comedians do. Like, he seems like the type of comic that says something because he believes it, at least on some level, even if he's exaggerating it for the punchline or whatever. And one thing I like about him is that he's a pretty introspective and sort of like world observant comedian. Like, he's talking about patterns that he sees. He's trying to figure things out, right? He's not just giving like boring social takes about wokeness or whatever, even though there's a little bit of that. But it's like he's using his brain to try to come up with interesting, almost like satirical takes on the balance of power and that sort of thing. And so that is a little bit more in the tradition of the type of comedians that I like. Not just like boring contrarian takes, but trying to say something interesting. And so I think Tim Dillon's decent at that. And this Netflix special that he did was pretty good in terms of that. I mean, there's some weird stuff in there. And I guess it depends on how open you are to comedy in general. I think as a comedian, he's pretty solid. So even the things that he says that I don't agree with, I find entertaining on a level that I wouldn't say is true for like Joe Rogan. When Joe Rogan says certain kind of right-leaning takes on stage, it's boring. It's hacky. So Tim Dillon can be pretty hacky too because of the way, the people he associates himself with. But for the most part, I think he's pretty good at the craft. And so I like that about him. But, that's most of what I have to say about the special. He did a long bit about RFK. He seems to really think he's like best friends with RFK and that RFK is a really cool, interesting guy. So maybe I'll get to that at some point. But really what I wanted to highlight was a clip that I saw of him talking to Megyn Kelly. Because this is just a little bit more of a straightforward political take from him. And he's talking about the offshoring of jobs and, essentially globalization and doing the right-wing populist move, which is focusing on that instead of literally anything else. Like, you listen to this right-wing populist perspective and you would think that there's no element to wage or income inequality in America other than globalization of jobs, which it's a huge part of it, but there is a reason that they focus on that. So that's what I want to talk about here. Check this clip out.
Yeah, I think that the American working class has been thrown aside by both parties. Yeah. And I think that people in this country that are fortunate can't fully understand the desperation in a lot of parts of the country that have been ignored. And I think a lot of that has to do with the deindustrialization of the country. Now, there's going to be periods of adjustment. There's going to be ugliness. There's going to be, but I think the country's more than an economic zone. I don't think you could see it as just a place to make money. I think you have to see it as a place where you have a culture. A country's something where you have to go to war to protect, right? I don't think people can just see it as a place where there are financial opportunities.
Yeah, we got a roaring market.
Yeah, right. So I think that obviously it's important that people have a good standard of living, that they have money. We all want those things, but I also think there has to be some attention paid to large swaths of the country that are not sharing in any of the prosperity of the last, 20 to 30 years.
It's like, I've heard you talk about how in 20 years, the Democrats became Republicans and the Republicans became the Democrats.
Right.
And it's really so true in so many ways because you look at the Democrats used to talk like that.
Yeah.
But it got changed into all they want to do is create one big social safety net. It's just giveaways, government giveaways,
Right.
you're a single mother, here's another check.
Right.
As opposed to Trump's approach, which seems to be, let me change the whole environment around you so you have more working opportunities. Let me lighten your tax burden if you're a waitress.
Right.
As opposed to just let me dump a bunch of free phones or goodies on you so that you'll keep voting for me.
The Democratic Party was purchased by Wall Street, and Wall Street has ideas about how the way the country should function. Wall Street wants endless supply of cheap labor. They want open borders. The Koch brothers loved open borders. It was because it was an endless supply of cheap labor. It broke the back of the working class. It destroyed unions, and it provided companies with low wage labor so that their profits went up. None of those profits were shared with their workers.
But they got bigger mansions at the top.
Got bigger mansions at the top. And the Democratic Party became completely purchased by Wall Street. And then identity politics is then kind of manifested as a way to convince people that actually they are interested in changing things. But by changing things, they don't mean giving you healthcare. They mean giving you a trans Batman.
Right.
That's what they're doing, right? So they're basically
saying, Snow White who hates Snow White.
Snow White who's not into it, right? Who thinks it's some type of fantasy or something, like it's a children's book. But it becomes a great, there's a great quote, and it's for things to stay the same, they must change, or something of that nature. Things must change to stay the same.
Yeah.
What the Democratic Party has become is a party that says, we're going to give you a female CEO, but we're not going to give you any bit more, of a pathway to a life. Mm-hmm. So we're going to give you
better feel good about the fact that there's a female CEO. You better feel good about
the fact that there's progress in this very aesthetic area that doesn't matter really to your life. Mm-hmm. Other than to say, well, that's nice, Yeah. But most people are concerned with the financial reality of their own family.
So I thought this clip was funny because in the first part of it, you can almost see him kind of go blank a little bit for a second here, which I relate to. I think anybody is capable of doing that, even a professional entertainer. I think in a context where he's actually being asked to talk about what he specifically believes and not just kind of a satirical, sarcastic version of what he believes, I think he kind of felt that pressure in this moment a little bit. And, just most of what he says here isn't all that coherent. But I want to point it out because Tim Dillon is a guy who has really become what a lot of people consider a voice of populism, and a political voice that is not only supposedly unaffiliated between Democrats and Republicans, but somebody who is kind of pro-worker and pro-little guy, and critiquing politics and politicians from a sort of systemic perspective in a way. And I think there's an appetite for that. Certainly there is on the left, but just people in general, I think, want that kind of voice. But a lot of people who are maybe allergic to things that sound more left-wing or use more left-wing or Marxian type of language, they might gravitate towards something like Tim Dillon because it feels less politically affiliated, even though he's done interviews with J.D. Vance and Steve Bannon. I mean, he's more affiliated with Republicans than your average woke comedian is affiliated with the Democratic Party, for sure. And same can be said with Joe Rogan, Tony Hinchcliffe. I mean, if you think that comedy was corrupted by wokeness or whatever, look at what's happening right now with some of these most popular figures on the comedy scene. They're completely being courted by the right. And if you think the right is underdogs or something, good for you, but they are more powerful almost than anybody has ever been. I mean, RFK Jr. is, even with a relatively marginal administration job, he's one of the most powerful guys in the world. So like, you know, being buddy with a guy like that. And that's one thing about Tim Dillon that I do think is interesting, is I think he's genuinely curious about these guys. And his motivation doesn't seem to be he wants to schmooze with them. It seems to be he's trying to sort of figure out what's going on in the world. And I think that's why his perspective can be interesting. But what he says here about offshoring jobs and everything, he paints a pretty nice picture, pretty vivid picture, good communicator there. But if you're sharp, you notice that there's really not a lot of substance to what he said, because he's talking about how these companies have offshored these jobs and that that's bad for the American worker. And he says that Republicans and Democrats have switched places so that Republicans are now playing the role of what Democrats were playing. And that's such an interesting observation, and Megyn Kelly, you know, agrees with that relatively emphatically. And that's so interesting because of how little substance there is. There's almost no substance to that at all. And later, in critiquing the sort of identity politics lean that the Democratic Party has taken on for the last however long, I don't know, he says that it's about an aesthetic. It's about the aesthetic of equality and more diverse. The power structures don't change, but the people that are operating those power structures have become more diversified. And that is actually a good critique of neoliberalism. That's true. Rather than fix the system, what you try to do is create more minority representation within the system so that everybody feels like they, at some point, have the chance to be at the top of the hierarchy. So rather than fixing the problems that people find lower down in the food chain, you just create an environment where everybody feels like they have a chance to, climb over everybody else's heads and make it to the top. So there's a real critique there, but he's not illustrating anything about what is the redistributive policy. I mean, what are we talking about? Because if you're talking about, politicians that are advocating for the little guy, for workers, if you're going to say that Republicans are doing what Democrats have always done, you're certainly not talking in terms of race or immigration, or abortion. So you must be talking about workers and like this general idea of economic stability. But even then, Republicans are not talking about redistribution in any way. The reason they don't talk about it is because they redistribute money in one direction, and that is up to the richest people much richer than Tim Dillon, but he catches some on the way up for sure. And so, the idea that I see what he's saying aesthetically, that in a lot of ways Republicans are appealing to a lot of the people that Democrats should be appealing to, but there's just absolutely no sense of what any of the policy means. And I think the reason these guys like to focus on offshoring, this is something you hear from Steve Bannon a lot, and different people who are in this sort of right-wing populist flank that are trying to convince as many workers as possible and to have had a certain amount of success at doing it, that Republicans are the ones who are in favor of policies that are going to benefit working people. And what they have to do is they have to focus on the narrative of offshoring jobs and globalization. Steve Bannon's been talking about globalization since 2016, since before Trump won the first time. And there's a lot of truth to it. It's an accurate observation that businesses have been allowed to offshore jobs for much cheaper labor elsewhere. It has hurt unions, and it has created a situation where America is weaker, and the lower classes of America are certainly weaker, and the top earners in the country are benefiting handsomely from all over the world, and Americans are not seeing any of that benefit. So if you want to change that, what you would do is you would regulate those companies. You would make it illegal for them to do certain things, like cut wages by putting factories in places where they don't have to pay fair wages, or make it harder for them to hire illegal immigrants, make it so that immigrants that are in the country illegally or undocumented can more easily become citizens so that they are not taken advantage of for their labor. Those are the kind of policies that will prevent companies from taking advantage in that way. But Republicans can't and don't advocate for any of that, because that would require them to regulate companies, and no matter what their rhetoric is, that's something they're never going to do. And Sam Cedar has pointed this out about RFK as well, is that RFK, the stuff that actually convinces people about RFK that he's going to get rid of this and that and the food, and he's going to make certain kinds of food harder to sell to people in America. Yeah, all that's great. That sounds great because it's government regulation. All of that, getting rid of red dye 40 or whatever it's called, that's all an example of regulation and how regulation can be utilized to protect people from companies poisoning them. But that regulation is like completely at odds with anything that any Trump administration or most Republican administrations would ever do. And so what they have to do is they have to find weird workarounds like tariffs that change the entire political environment, and again, to be as charitable as possible, probably too charitable. The idea behind tariffs or any type of any of this weird policy that Trump is trying to do, this sort of destabilizing policy, is that he's trying to create a situation that's more advantageous to Americans, so that, I don't know, some of that wealth will be imported or something like that. I don't know. And none of these guys know either. They pretend to know. They pretend that that's the idea. But at the end of the day, there's a much simpler solution that Republicans are not just allergic to, they're completely opposed to. And that's really the fundamental dynamic of what makes Republicans non-populist by definition. And what makes anybody entertaining the idea that any Republican is populist, they're just unserious on the face of it, because Republicans are opposed to regulation. Republicans are opposed to doing anything that doesn't benefit companies. And the only reason Trump was willing to do tariffs, which ostensibly companies don't want, is because it gives the companies the ability to pass that on to the consumer. And if that's not the idea, then okay, pass some regulations that make it illegal for them to do that. Now we're talking, right? But they're not going to do that. There hasn't even been a whisper that they're going to do that, because Republicans don't regulate. Republicans do not tell companies that they can't do things that rip off consumers. And this happens at every single level of our society. It happens in housing, it happens in banking, it happens in the job market. At every level, workers and consumers are undercut, and the people who are already rich, already hoarding the wealth, benefit. And Tim Dillon knows this because, to an extent, he's one of these people. I think that he has some kind of real estate investments or something like that, and I think that that's how he's been able to build a foundation for his career that's allows him to succeed in entertainment. Not to say that he hasn't been successful in entertainment on his own, but having that type of foundation and income somewhere else makes it so that you have more creative freedom. And so I think he has found that in the real estate industry, is my understanding, and that aligns him with a certain incentive and a certain kind of values, where you are going to see the value of deregulation, and you aren't necessarily opposed to consumers, renters, workers being in positions where they don't have any leverage. Because if you really wanted to solve the problem of those people and enact policies that are going to be good for their lives, what you would do is you would put in place government regulations and practices that defend those workers against companies and against private entities trying to take advantage of them. That's the way to even out the inequality of this country. And to the extent that policies similar to that have been implemented, they've either worked well or they have been sabotaged by Republicans or neoliberals. And so this is where the right-wing populism thing veers off into just an excuse. And when the last thing I want to point out about that clip is that Tim Dillon says the only way for things to stay the same is for them to change, which is a nice little sort of Orwellian twist of phrase. I'm not sure where he said that came from, but he says that the times are going to get tough sometimes. Sometimes you got to do things that are going to make things tough, but ultimately things have to change. And what he's saying is that for America for middle class Americans or whatever to continue to have a standard of living, an acceptable standard of living, things like Trump's tariffs or this draconian immigration policy have to be done so that we can re-find, a balance and stability. That's what he's saying. But the way he's saying it is so coy there, because what he's kind of saying, especially in regards to immigration, and I feel like that's what he was hinting at because he had just mentioned immigration a moment earlier. Basically what he's saying is, close your eyes. Close your eyes for now. Because we're all seeing the same thing. We're all seeing Trump disappearing people. We're all seeing Trump doing these ridiculous tariffs that are severing our ties with important allies and just causing chaos for no good reason. And they're upping the prices on consumers. We're all seeing that. But just ignore it for now. Because, especially in terms of immigration, if we just wait it out, and if you're one of the ones who makes it through what we're seeing happen, then we're all going to benefit from it at the end of the day. That's essentially the proposition. If we all just close our eyes and ears while they get as many people out of the country as possible, then that's going to create more room in the economy and higher wages, supposedly. That's the theory. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but I do believe that a lot of them believe that that's what's going to happen. And that's what they want us to do. They want us to close our eyes and ears to the reality of what Trump and his people are doing and have always wanted to do in favor of some kind of new world order, new normal. And whether that includes martial law, whether that includes a recession, whether it includes a depression, gulag, concentration camp style, extraordinary renditions of people, whether they're residents or citizens or whoever they are, just get as many people out of the country, especially the brown ones as we can, especially the socialists, especially the ones who speak badly about Trump. Get as many of them out of the country as we can, and there's going to be more opportunity for all the people who are willing to close their eyes and ears.